Wow, normally I have to do my shh move. Not today. Hello, everybody. I'm Willow Bay, Dean of the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and I am joined by Marty Kaplan, Founding Director of the Norman Lear Center. We are thrilled to be presenting the Ev Rogers Award today. We would like to welcome those of you who are joining us on Facebook Live and all of you who are here in this room. Fantastic to see all of you here today. We would also like to welcome our distinguished award recipient, Ms. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Welcome. I was fortunate enough to be a member of the committee, the Rogers Award Committee, and was thrilled when the committee unanimously selected Ms. Adichie as this year's award winner. So I should tell you a little bit about where we are. We're here at Wallace Annenberg Hall, where, as you can see, we're on the corner. It's sort of a crossroads of campus. And you can also see that we have a crowd here that extends 3-4 stories high. So welcome to all of you who are up there. We think of this as our public square, where we connect around critical issues of the day, where we connect and communicate with not just our students on campus and faculty and scholars, but with our communities surrounding the school, with our industries of practice, and with our public. At Annenberg, we have roughly 2,500 students, doctoral, graduate, and undergrad, and they study communications, journalism, public relations, and public diplomacy. And as a community of scholarly inquiry, we often find ourselves examining the power of stories. We know stories can entertain, we know they can educate. They also allow us to excavate buried truths, work through humanity's most complex problems, and achieve more equitable and more just realities. We also examine with a critical lens the choices we make as storytellers, the choices we make as journalists, the choices we make as communicators. And with the Lear Center, we have a perfect partner in this endeavor. We also have the spirit and energy of its founder, Norman Lear, one of the towering figures in American culture. He is our guide and our beacon. Norman Lear's gift, made nearly 20 years ago, enabled the establishment of the Norman Lear Center, which administers the Ev Rogers Award. So what the Lear Center does is studies the impact of entertainment on the world, socially, culturally, economically, and yes, politically. And it helps bridge the gap between the entertainment industry, academia, and the public at large. Now I'd like to ask Marty Kaplan, the founding director of the Lear Center, to take the podium. Marty.
Thank you, Willow, and thank you all for coming a long distance, and thank you all for being here. I do want to start by thanking the people who made this event and everything that preceded it possible. So please join me in a warm applause for Veronica Haudicke and for the Dean's Public Events and Marketing team. Welcome to the Ev Rogers Award. We lost Ev Rogers in 2004. He was a professor here at Annenberg and an associate dean. If you know the term early adopter, you know Ev. It comes from his book, Diffusion of Innovations. That book has been in print ever since it was published in 1962. Half a century later, today, it's the second most cited book in all of the social sciences. Ev knew that stories can change lives. I remember a talk he gave here about a public health campaign in Tanzania that he worked on. He showed that a radio soap opera could fight HIV/AIDS. He showed that fictional characters who used condoms could influence real people's behavior. As Willow said, it's my privilege to direct the Norman Lear Center. Norman is among the greatest storytellers in the history of TV. His series have not only entertained countless millions, his shows have also informed us, provoked us, shaped our beliefs about racism, sexism, homophobia, rape, war, all the combustible issues of our time. Stories matter. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie uses stories to grow our empathy and our aspirations. In her fiction and in her essays, in her novels and in her talks, she weaves her insights about gender, race, and identity into the narratives of human experience. You may know her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, among the most watched of all time. In it, she uses her experience as an African woman to show the harm done by stereotypes that deny our diversity. Her TED Talk prompts a juicy research question. What stories about Africa and its 54 nations are American journalists and screenwriters telling? Last year, the Lear Center analyzed 700,000 hours of American news and entertainment to answer that question, and we just released our findings. Even though Africans are among the world's most optimistic people about their future, Africa's image in American media is by and large a single story of terrorism, corruption, poverty, disease, famine, war, and Western saviors. But what about African innovation, entrepreneurialism, music, fashion, art, and the new generation making its mark on the world stage? Who will tell those stories? Who will tell the stories of the creative, hopeful, rising voices in Africa and around the world? They will, and you will. You are the journalists, writers, artists, filmmakers, educators, poets, innovators, change makers, and builders of the future. Your stories matter. You matter. This award honors Ev Rogers and Chimamanda Adichie. If their work inspires you, this award honors you. I'd like you to join me in recognizing the Rogers Award Committee. And would you all please rise and hold your applause for a moment? The chair, Peter Clark, who was the former dean of Annenberg, who actually hired Ev Rogers, Dean Bay, and faculty from across the campus and the country. Leo Brody, Casey Cole, Joe Mayer, Tom Valenti, Noshir Contractor, and the first winner of the award, Arvind Singhal. Please thank them. Let's see who else they've honored.
I'm deeply honored to be a recipient of this award.
I hope to be in that tradition in talking about how we create a better world, how we make change.
And in those days, there were some significant epidemiological studies that there was a coming health inequality.
I'll share with you our worldwide applications of a psychosocial approach.
A lot of interventions are aimed at individuals. You must stop smoking. You must wear your seatbelt. But the reality is that we all are not islands.
Well, you know, one of the things about doing research where you actually talk to people, you actually need to listen.
I want to talk today about adoption and get into what we mean when we talk about things going viral and spreading virally online.
And I think that's what we have to have such respect for what this text is. It's, you know, it has that feeling of the person just did this. Their fingers just touched the keys, and it's to you.
We need to ask, in the tradition of Ev Rogers, what kind of scholarship do we need to understand and then protect ourselves from the more pernicious uses?
We have got to move from the point where women are defined as property to the point where women around the world are defined as persons. Thank you very much.
Well, we're also thrilled today to have a very special guest with us to introduce our Ev Rogers Award recipient, and that is Danai Gurira. Welcome, Danai. There simply cannot be a danger of a single story, Danai, when it comes to introducing you. You all, of course, recognize her as Okoye from the Academy Award nominated and SAG Award winning, bravo, madam, Black Panther. Go ahead. Absolutely. And do we have any Walking Dead fans here? Okay, you all know her as Michonne from Walking Dead. But she's also an activist. She is the co-founder of Almasi Arts, a Zimbabwean American dramatic arts collaborative. She was recently appointed as a Goodwill Ambassador for UN Women to help put a spotlight on gender equality and women's rights, as well as to bring unheard women's voices front and center. Also, she happens to be an award-winning playwright. One of her plays earned 6 Tony nominations. One just closed in London, and another one, Familiar, opened in San Diego, so hopefully you all will get a chance to see it. And along with her very talented friend and collaborator, Lupita Nyong'o, she is adapting Ms. Adichie's novel, Americanah, for television. Maybe you'll come screen the first episode here. Yeah? Okay. Both as an actor and a playwright, Danai seeks intense, truthful human storytelling. She strives to create and inhabit characters that audiences can't get out of their souls. She wants us to look at the fullness of ourselves as human beings. And like Ms. Adichie, Danai recognizes the power of her words and the power of her choices. And she's come to understand the power of her own name. In a column she wrote for Glamour magazine, she described her background. She was born in Grinnell, Iowa, to Zimbabwean parents who were academics, another reason we love you. And as a little girl, she had a nickname. She was called Dee Dee. And it wasn't until she was 5 years old that her mother revealed that her real name was Danai. In her parents' native language, Shona, Danai means to love one another. And her middle name, Jekasai, means to illuminate. Still, her family continued to call her Dee Dee even after they moved back to Zimbabwe about a year later. And it wasn't until she was a teenager that she began to ask people to call her Danai. A choice, her choice. I wanted to bring light to those who should be seen more, heard more, people of marginalized cultures, she wrote. That choice has affected every choice I've made since, the stories I tell, the characters I play, the activism I embark upon. Like Danai, our honoree today, Chimamanda Adichie, has a name that evokes strength and courage. In Igbo, Chimamanda means my personal spirit will never be broken. And in Ngotsi, her middle name, means blessing. When she insisted that an interviewer call her Ms. Chimamanda Adichie rather than call her by her husband's name, it caused a cultural firestorm in her native Nigeria, or a lot of noise, as Ms. Adichie called it. I kept my name because I like my name, she wrote in Dear Ejewele, or a feminist manifesto in 15 suggestions. And she added in suggestion 7 that in a truly just society, women should not be expected to make marriage-based changes that men are not expected to make. So as we examine the power of our choices and the values they communicate, we recognize the power these two women have claimed, and we celebrate their unique abilities to inspire us all with the words they write and with the lives they lead. We must be deliberate in recognizing and celebrating the power of stories, but we must also be deliberate in naming, celebrating, and recognizing our storytellers. So please join me in welcoming Denai Jakasai Gurira to the stage.
She says my name so good. Thank you so much for having me, Dean Bay and USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. It is an honor to be here and to celebrate this astounding woman. Enid Blyton, Judy Blume, Nancy Drew, Mallory Towers, Babysitter's Club. These were authors and books myself and many of my fellow African diaspora sisters grew up consuming. I was raised in post-colonial Southern Africa. Friends of mine raised in Eastern and Western Africa, some even in the suburbs of Massachusetts, we all had the same narrative in this area. These were the books that us Black girls were given access to. Options were not varied. Alternatives were not validated. We were immersed in the worlds of British all-girls boarding schools and child detectives and girls called Margaret, and even a Black doll called Sambo. The perspective was always Eurocentric. The images never reflected who we were, the lives we lived, the people who surrounded us, the environment, the culture, the language, the food, the history, the customs. We were peering into a world that told us we were the outsider, the other, and that these were the chosen and legitimate bearers of human experience. Theirs was the culture to aspire to. Theirs were the struggles to bear witness to. They were who and what mattered. That does a lot to the psyche of a growing person in the world. It makes it clear that this world was not fashioned with you in mind. It makes it seem obvious that you must assimilate into the dominant culture in order to succeed, in order to count. Story has the power to do that. With its all-encompassing ability to take over the mind, the imagination, the emotions, and even the soul, storytelling can and does deeply shape how we perceive the world and ourselves. The first time I read a book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a thirst was quenched. I was hit by how included I was in the narrative, how lives and experiences were vividly illuminated on the page in a way that I had yet to experience. Lives of people like me, living in African realities full of their own specific complexities, were suddenly center stage. Not only did we matter in these worlds she brought to life, but now we mattered to newfound readers around the globe because the excellence of her skills as a writer were undeniable to all. Chimamanda broke the African female voice into mainstream consciousness, and she did it without compromising. She was to us Black girls what James, and she is to us Black girls, what James Baldwin was to the Black people in America, our barometer, bold and unapologetic, a powerful intellect, indicting and yet full of humor and riddled with humanity. She quenches a thirst you may not even know you have. You feel a companionship with her characters. I only fully realized how parched I was from characters who truly shared my perspective when I read Half of a Yellow Sun and Americanah. How much I had previously been denied. I was even more floored by how her work impacted those not from the continent. The Western and global audience her work engaged were now led to identify with people like me, live in my head for a while, see the world from my point of view. Because Chimamanda's characters become companions. You yearn to return to them when you step away. You miss them when you complete the read. I remember how deeply my heart ached for Ugwu, the young man who completed the trio of protagonists in Half of a Yellow Sun. How he journeyed through a transition into civil war that led him to behave far differently from the young man we had grown to know and love. I remember marveling at how brilliant that was, how Chimamanda had literally turned on its head the stereotype around young men engaged in civil conflict on the continent. You could never view the issues and those who get caught up in that system the same way again. I remember the first time I read Americanah. I was struck with a rather disturbing feeling that this woman had stolen my diaries, that she'd been watching my life and dabbled with its details to create this starkly familiar journey of an African girl in America. I felt a strong sense of affirmation every time people from the West spoke of how her work enraptured them, how much it felt familiar to them, and how much it yet illuminated Africa to them, this place previously known to them in distorted, broad, and brutal stereotypes alone. Her body of work proves that great storytelling that is courageous and unflinchingly pursues the truth, storytelling that delves with specificity and complexity into places both uncomfortable and unexpected, that sort of storytelling is universally appealing and shatters seemingly insurmountable walls about whose stories get to be boldly told. That sort of storytelling forms bridges, bringing us all that much closer together on equal footing. Currently, I have the daunting joy of adapting her masterpiece, Americanah, to a miniseries. It seems only fitting that the first African female protagonist on American television be Chimamanda's resonantly crafted Ifemelu. That it be her creation that popularizes and personalizes the African immigrant experience on TV screens across America. I've always described Chimamanda as my author. I remember the one and only time I met her other than today. She does not remember. It was in Edinburgh, Scotland in 2006. I was there to perform my two-hander play in the Continuum in the festival, and she was at the book festival. I was deeply immersed in Purple Hibiscus and just felt a fervent kinship with her as a writer. She was doing the thing that I was striving to do as a playwright, bringing forward African stories in a new way. I approached her with the unabashed, unbridled enthusiasm of a fan. As she signed my copy of her book, she checked in that I was actually reading it. When I related this story back to her recently, she said, "That sounds like me." That voice, what she sounds like, is what has freed women across the diaspora and women alike to embrace the word feminism, to break free of oppressive norms that guise themselves as tradition, to honor our heritage but refuse to conform to the ideals that curtail our full potential. That voice has impacted the world times over, and every time the world formally acknowledges this impact, like today, those of us who call Chimamanda my author celebrate and feel affirmed all over again. It is therefore with the greatest honor I present Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, AKA my author, on behalf of USC's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism by the Norman Lear Center with the 2009 Ev Rogers Award.
So I have a citation to read.
Okay.
for her contribution to the global conversation about gender, race, and identity, for her gifts as a storyteller to inspire and empower, and for summoning us, in her words, to counter lies with facts repeatedly and unflaggingly, while also proclaiming the greater truths of our equal humanity, of decency, and of compassion. The USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism has the honor to present the 2019 Ev Rogers Award to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
Hello. I'm actually trying very hard not to be emotional. Danai, thank you. Thank you because that was, you've done honor to my work, and I appreciate it very much because from one writer to another, thank you. I deeply appreciate it. And can I just say how excited I am that Danai is adapting Americanah? We had a long, we had a long chat about Americanah, and I hung up just feeling at peace, and I thought my book is in good hands, and no pressure, but I'm so looking forward to it, and I just know that I think it's going to be very good. I'm sorry, I need a minute to, I didn't plan to become emotional. We should all blame Danai for this. I'm doing what I love, and it means a lot to me that it means a lot to people. So. So I'm delighted to be receiving this award in honor of that great thinker, Ev Rogers. And I'm even more delighted to be in such good company. Listening to Kathleen Hall Jamieson on YouTube talking about Russian hacking and Rosabeth Kanter talking about innovation was not only enlightening, but also, perhaps a little oddly, affirming. I seem these days always to be in search of what is affirming. Perhaps a sign of the times in which we live, that I am desperately drawn to what is meaningful, what is human, what is beautiful. I have 2 homes, and I should say that I used to roll my eyes at people who would say they had 2 homes. But now I'm one of those people, so I roll my eyes at myself sometimes. But I do have 2 homes. I live in Lagos, in Nigeria, and I live in Maryland here in the US. Oh, Niger, yes! Okay. And here in the US, I live in Maryland. In Maryland, my husband and I live with our daughter in a wonderfully bland, safe suburb between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. So one day recently, I drove into a large, nondescript parking lot of a shopping mall. I parked my car next to a big black truck. As I was getting out of my car, I noticed the white man sitting in the truck was looking at me. And then he took his window down, and in that moment, I felt a sudden, surprising stab of fear. I just knew that his intentions were not good, could not be good. He was going to hurt me. He was going to shout nigger at me. He had a gun. He was going to shoot me. I remember feeling almost frozen with panic. And then the man spoke. He asked me if my side mirrors did what it did automatically. And his tone was admiring. And I said yes. And then as I walked away, he told me that my hair, which was in cornrows, was beautiful. He was not lecherous at all. His tone was respectful and kind, simply one human being talking to another, strangers sharing a moment. As I walked away, I felt close to tears. How had it come to this, that simply being looked at by a white man in a truck filled me with panic? I have lived off and on in the United States for 20 years, and I had never felt like that before. This is what it means to live in a country where the political tone is one of fear and division. Later, I laughed at myself, or I tried to laugh at myself. I told myself that I was being unreasonable. But was I? I'm relatively privileged. There are people much worse off, people whose fear, unlike mine, easily becomes a real nightmare. People separated from family members, people violently yanked away from the only lives they know in the only country they know. I grew up under military dictatorships in Nigeria. I was a precocious child, and I first became politically aware under the military dictatorship of General Buhari, who ironically is now Nigeria's democratic president. I was very young, but I remember one evening my parents had visitors in our living room in Nsukka, the university town where I grew up. I remember that my parents and their friends were talking about something political, something to do with soldiers. And I remember that they were whispering, their voices very low and muted. And I remember thinking, why are they whispering? The doors are closed, our house is big, the yard is large. Who could possibly hear them? Looking back now, that too was unreasonable. But that is how political fear functions. Fear is a form of control. Fear is a tool that without even consciously knowing, you use against yourself. Citizens in a democracy should disagree with one another. They should argue and engage. They should have competing worldviews. They should have spirited battles of ideas. They should dislike worldviews that differ from theirs, and even dislike those who hold the competing worldviews. But should they live in fear? Does the democracy still count as a democracy if citizens live in fear? America has always been aspirational to me. As a child, America to me was a radiant symbol, a country shining on the hill. It was not perfection that I admired in America, because even as a young reader, I was familiar with America's imperfections, its hypocrisies. I knew that America had been complicit in many atrocities. For example, in the killing of a shining light in my own continent, Patrice Lumumba. What I admired was that America somehow always seemed sure of itself, sure of what it stood for. It was a nation that knew what it was doing. It was a nation that protected all of its own. It might not care about other nations and about the rest of the world, but it would do everything to save its own. My childhood and teenagehood was spent under the military dictatorships of Buhari, Babangida, and Abacha. And I grew up with an existential uncertainty, a feeling that is familiar to many developing nations. I knew that I could never say definitely that something could never happen politically. Anything could happen at any time. And so America became the place where certainty existed, and consistency, and order. A place refreshingly free of that sense of anything can happen. That, my friends, is no longer the case. The election of this American president has flattened the poetry in America's founding philosophy. The country born from an idea of freedom is now governed by an unstable, stubbornly uninformed, authoritarian demagogue. And yes, that is my opinion. As a storyteller, I am interested in the singular and the specific, because from this, I believe, springs the universal. And I'm also interested in the idea of what is possible. I read all genres. I like to think of myself as a very Catholic reader, but one genre that I've had very great difficulty getting into is speculative fiction. And yet I found myself thinking in speculative terms lately. So what if? What if everyone simply refuses to use the expression fake news? Because it is saying that over and over again that gives it legitimacy. There is inaccurate news, there is biased news, there is incomplete news, but that expression, fake news, is heavy with the ugly connotation that journalism is some kind of deliberate conspiracy. It is not. And the man who has made that expression, fake news, so common, really just uses it to mean news that he does not like. Whether it is true or not is irrelevant. What if journalists all over this country decided to burn forever that idea of false equivalences? What if instead of focusing on balance, we focused on truth? What if we stopped pretending that both sides of an issue are equal when they are not? What if we decided that news should not entertain us, but should inform us and educate us? What if we all agree that we have to be nimble and alert and clear-eyed and skeptical, that we have to be active rather than reactive? There are today valid and worrying concerns that face our future as humans. There's inequality, gender, racial, economic, there's climate change, there's a place of artificial intelligence. But I find myself most worried about the possible death of critical thinking, and consequently the death of empathy, because both are central to how we understand and deal with all of the other challenges we face. It might seem odd to connect critical thinking and empathy, but the two are related. If we are able to think critically, then we're more able to exercise empathy. Critical thinking is quite simply the ability to think clearly, to hold ideas in your mind, to weigh them, to dissect them. And if we're able to do this, then we're able to truly see other human beings. Colum McCann says that to read a book is to be alive in a body that is not your own. And I would broaden that to storytelling. To listen to stories is to be alive in a body that is not your own. That, for me, is the best example of that link between critical thinking and empathy. To be alive in a body that is not your own, to hear another person's story, to truly see another person. And this matters. It matters because empathy and critical thinking as starting points will radically change the way we deal with everything. I recently read an American public official talking about Central Americans who were sending their children to the US border, hoping that they could cross over. And this American public official said, well, if you don't want your children to be treated badly, then don't send them to cross the US border illegally, because that is irresponsible parenting. This kind of response demonstrates not only a lack of empathy and an inability to imagine what another person's story is, but also an inability to think clearly. Because otherwise, this American official would know that the parents sending their children to the border are far from irresponsible, that theirs is in fact a heart-wrenching act of love, born of that desire to want more and to want better for your offspring. I believe that our greatest human need is to be seen, and I mean seen in a broad sense. We want to be acknowledged, we want to be loved, we want dignity, we want to be allowed our flaws, and we want to strive to improve. And while I want to end on a positive note, it's difficult for me to do that because I want to say that my greatest fear is that this country is sliding into ugly ordinariness, an ordinariness that makes it difficult for all of its citizens to feel seen. So all of you young people, change that, please. Thank you.
Chimamanda, thank you. That was quite extraordinary. Are you open to taking some questions from the audience?
Yes, of course.
Well, what we've done is we've asked to kick us off some of our students. And I might move in this direction. And Jordan, if I may start with you, and will you please introduce yourself and start with your question? Do you have a mic or do you need mine? You got, okay.
Hi, Chimamanda. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jordan. I'm at the Annenberg School. I study strategic public relations. And my question for you is, during your interview with The Guardian last year, you identified your frustrations with young people for yielding to a culture that fosters a fundamental lack of compassion. What can my generation do to combat this unforgiving culture and become more compassionate?
Stop canceling people. Think of them as humans. No, I kind of mean that, actually. I mean, for me, it's two competing things. So on the one hand, there's something I find very encouraging about activism, about young people who are all really, I think, coming from a well-meaning place, which is that they want better for everybody. What worries me is that there is a kind of, it very often feels quite extreme in the way that it seems that people no longer think of people as complex humans, that, you know, one slip and you're done, right? And people say you're canceled and you're no longer relevant. And it seems to me not a very productive way of thinking about these things, and also really not practical, because we're all flawed. And in some ways, then it becomes a question of how many flaws can you take? So what I would say to your generation is, it's not so much that you shouldn't call people out, because that's kind of the thing, you know, call out. It's also that maybe you should read a little more, and I'm not kidding. and by read a little more, I mean, don't have an opinion until you look at the primary source of whatever it is that is the sort of the outrage du jour. And maybe just read things that are outside of social media. I think sometimes context is lacking in the way that things are seen. And I find also quite troubling that there is a kind of orthodoxy on the left in this country, which you're supposed to abide by. And when you don't abide by it, there's a quickness to attribute ill intent to your positions. And I kind of feel that that's a dangerous way to think. It can sometimes feel like kind of like re-education camp, where people will say to you, well, you haven't said what you're supposed to, well, you better retract. Rather than, let's engage with your idea and see where you're coming from. I think that the quickness to outrage is what feels to me just deeply lacking in compassion, right? The people who are canceled are actual human beings who often mean well, if we give them a chance to. And by the way, I was talking to a young person the other day, and she said, and I said, it was something outrageous, and I said, well, do you want to know what they really think? And she said, no, I already know the words, so that's bad. It's almost as though there's not even room to, there's no room for nuance, there's no room for sort of expanding on what means. It's a bit too much. So also the other thing I want to say to young people is get off social media and read a book or 2 books or 3.
Thank you.
Ayana, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Ayana, and I'm a sophomore here. I study journalism. And my question for you is, so you gave a TED talk about the dangers of a single story and about how ultimately single stories are dehumanizing. So how can we as journalists work to not tell single stories?
I think by listening. I think journalism I think it's a very noble profession. I think it's also quite difficult because you have this enormous responsibility, right? That your work can in fact rob people of their dignity. But also it can do the reverse. I think listening is important. And so whenever I like to, whenever the foreign journalists go into Africa, and sometimes they sort of think that I have all the answers to things, right? So they're like, so what should we do when we go to Africa? And I love having that power because, of course, I don't have all the answers, right? But I kind of pretend I do. And I'm like, yes, well, the thing to do when you go to Africa. But really what I say is just if it's possible to put everything you know about Africa in a backpack, right? And then leave that backpack behind when you go. That's the way to go about it, just to have an open mind. And because I think that often when you're reporting on something, you find yourself trying to make your story align to what you already have in your mind, if that makes sense. So in general, I would say the problem with stereotypes really, again, is not that they're false, right? Stereotypes are not, it's that they're incomplete. And I think what's important in especially covering communities that are powerless, communities that are marginalized, is that it's important, the humanizing of those communities has to be, in my opinion, center stage. I think when you're covering somebody who's really powerful and you can afford a bit of a single story, that's fine. No, I'm joking. But but it's really that idea that humanizing people and always looking for the unexpected detail, that's always a good thing. The thing that surprises you about people, the thing that doesn't align with what you expect. Often those are the things that humanize people. And in some ways, I think fiction writing is similar. I'm constantly making notes in my phone because it's the things that surprise me about humanity that I make note of. And those are the things that I find to be worthy of storytelling. And in some ways, I think journalism is similar. And I think that's how we ultimately humanize people and end up not making them stereotypes.
Hi, my name is Christy. I study communication and I'm with Annenberg Media. I'm a reporter. I just wanted to ask about a year ago, you spoke about the Me Too movement and how we'd have to wait to see if it would turn out to be sort of a revolution or a fad, but that it gave you reason to be cautiously optimistic. So I was just wondering your thoughts on it now, almost a year later, and if you think that our kind of culture of cancellation has allowed for enough nuance to be in the conversation.
Right, tell me the last bit, the culture of cancellation.
Yeah, like you were talking about how we tend to cancel things without giving any nuance to the situation.
Yeah.
Do you think that has kind of stopped the Me Too movement from being as productive as it could be?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think I still largely feel the same way about the Me Too movement, which is that I feel cautiously optimistic, but also at the same time, I have reservations that I think anybody would have. I think all justice movements in their early stages cannot afford nuance. I think that's just the way it works. Because to establish itself, a justice movement just can't afford certain things. And I think that the Me Too movement is at a stage where, I'm not sure that it can afford the kind of nuance that I think I would want, ideally. And because really what's happening is that we've had so many years in which women simply were not taken seriously. Women's stories simply were not believed. And suddenly that's changing. I really think it's a very important point in sort of, it's not global really, it's Western, but it's a very important, I think it's really important. Whether it's going to be a fad, I still don't know. I mean, I do worry that even the way some of the stories are covered worries me because they, in some ways, they feed into certain stereotypes. So an example is, it seems to me that every story, in every Me Too story, almost every Me Too story, the woman is not just helpless, but often hapless. There's always, I think, on the part of journalists, a desire to make her utterly, utterly blameless. So it's almost as though we can't say, oh, well, she went to this guy's apartment thinking maybe they could hook up, maybe not, and then he assaults her. No, we have to make it like she had no idea it was his apartment, and she went up thinking it was the bathroom. That sort of thing. And I'm thinking we need to give women a certain agency. We don't, and it worries me because that kind of thinking where women, where before a woman is worthy of sympathy, she has to be the Blessed Virgin Mary, is misogynistic. Because I think we need to allow women to be complex and flawed and still be deserving of empathy and sympathy and justice, right? And so, I mean, so I think the concerns I have about the Me Too movement would be that the way that it's covered, the way that women, sometimes there's sort of women on TV telling their stories, and I sometimes feel that they're required to cry. And, I sometimes think, well, how about they don't cry? How about maybe we have a few more who just show burning rage? No tears, just burning damned rage. But again, I think the reason that doesn't happen often is because I think maybe the lawyers tell them, if you do that, you won't have sympathy, because a woman is not supposed to show anger, right? Because anger alienates people. I'm thinking now of the confirmation hearings of the man who's now, And I remember thinking, watching this brave woman speaking, it wasn't even so much that she was telling her story and that, of course, I believed her. It was that I was struck by how hard and how just deeply committed to being likable she was. She was helpful, she was polite. She looked at her notes 25 times to make sure she made no mistakes. And it was all, I think, because she was very much aware, as were whoever had advised her, that for a woman, even to tell your story in which you're assaulted, you still have to perform. You still have to perform gender. You still have to be likable and nice and kind. Because really, what if she had started off saying, fuck you? Which really, I think she should have, right? But she would not have, had any sympathy at all, any sympathy. So I think for me, maybe it's just that it's on the one hand that there are people who I think are so extreme with the Me Too movement, who think that to even ask a question means that you're misogynistic, and there are other people I think who are so sort of keen to be supportive that they end up, in my opinion, depriving women of agency.
We'd like to open it up to some questions. Do you have a choice or a preference as to where I go next with the questions?
Who has the coolest hair?
Oh.
And sorry, people, natural black hair.
Okay.
I love you all, but hey, natural black hair.
Can I send the mic back here? Okay. Got it? Okay.
Chimamanda, it's such a pleasure to, listen to you speak. I'm Nigerian as well, and I'm just deeply inspired by you. I remember reading Purple Hibiscus and just being blown away by how, wow, this is my story for the first time. And it's just such an honor to stand before you today.
Thank you.
But I wanted to ask, I'd like to know in your own words, what does it mean to be human?
That's a beautiful question, to which I have no answer. In Nigeria, we would say, this is how people feel exam. This is how I will just feel exam. To be human, that's such a, it's many things. It's to be vulnerable and to love and be loved and to feel a range of emotion and to feel a connection to other human beings, because it seems to me that it is the presence of other humans in the world that somehow feeds my humanity. It is,
All right, well, do we have time for a few more questions? I might just go up top just because you all, does anybody up there have a really good question? Oh, wait, I see one. All right, there should be a microphone up there. Yep, there we go. Ask and you shall receive. You got a mic.
Hi.
Hello.
I just want to ask about your, if you have any impressions about white alliance to Africans and Blacks in America.
I'm sorry, white alliance?
How whites can be allies to Blacks and Africans in America.
We're allies to Blacks and Africans in America. Okay, I don't know. Okay. No, you see, all right, I really said I was going to be well-behaved here because I'm just deeply honored to get this award, so I'm going to be well-behaved. But I really was just going to say that there's there's a language that's used, I think, in talking about sort of social justice things, and a word like ally, I sometimes don't know what it means because I think one very quickly runs afoul of the expectations of allyship or allydom. So, white Blacks and Africans in America, I guess listen to them, and maybe don't go to Africa to build wells, because, you know, Africans can build wells. I really think, in general, I think maybe it's a larger question about race and how we sort of navigate it and how we bridge it. Yeah, and I've always believed, and I guess because I'm a storyteller, so I do believe very much that in the end there's a human thing that every human being can connect to. But I also believe very much in how important it is to acknowledge our differences. I sometimes worry that in the bid to show that we are united as people who are progressives in general, that we want to diminish our differences. I think actually the way to go about it is the opposite. It's to acknowledge the many ways in which we're different and somehow to make that ordinary and normal. So it would be nice, for example, so I grew up, and I think in some ways, whiteness, because whiteness has so much power in this country, and is seen as the norm in many ways, there's, I think, a special responsibility that comes with whiteness, sorry. So I, for example, read a lot of women's magazines because I like to waste my time, and I know quite a bit about white women's hair. I can tell you, I can just tell you everything, right? I know it. Because that's, and the norm is sort of always the same. Here's what to do if you're blonde or a redhead or a brunette. But I'm thinking, where do I fit in? So my point really is, it's that if people get into positions of power to change these things, to make those spaces more inclusive, to widen, I think, to widen the definition of what is normal. And not just with Black people, right? Because I think that there are dark-skinned women from South Asia, for example, who would love to know how the hell to find the right shade of foundation. So, right, and nobody tells them because those magazines are like, well, if you're pale or if you're tan, And they're like, right. So I think, so if you're thinking about being a magazine editor, this is just, well, I thought I was looking for an opportunity to give my little rant about women's magazines. And I do have to say it's getting better, actually. I think things are better than it was, than they were 10, 15 years ago. But in general, really, I think I just want to say we need to listen more to one another. And we need to, I think, be a little slower in imagining ill intent, right? Because people, I think there's a great, great difference between malice and just not knowing. And sometimes in our bid to be fierce warriors for justice, I think we forget that.
All right, we're going to do one more. I'm going to let you pick.
Yes, of course. 2 more. Yeah.
We got all night. I don't know about you, but we could keep going.
How are you? I'm a doctoral student in the School of Education, studying educational leadership with a focus on teacher education. And considering that approximately 85% of the teaching force is white, female, and middle class, you talked about empathy and you talked about critical thought. And we say that there's not a lot of critical thought, or the research shows that people don't do a lot of critical reflection. How does that play itself out in a classroom with these dynamics when the lived experience of someone may not be reflected in the student population they're serving?
I actually have been interested in that lately because I'm interested in how the recruiting happens. So we live in a suburb of, sometimes people call it a suburb of DC, or other times suburb of Baltimore. And what I've noticed, and again, many of the teachers are white middle class women, but it's not for lack of, there are men and people of color being training as teachers, but I think it's often about the pathway to being recruited. Sometimes, a woman said to me, sometimes it's simply that to do the, what's the thing you do when you're in college where you go spend a bit of time?
Internship.
Yes, to do the internship, sometimes it's transportation that's the problem. And if you don't do the internship, you're not on the path to getting the position. So I think there's already a problem with just when it's still at a training level. Really, I think the only solution is that it has to become diverse. We can talk about the teachers, they need to learn about the students, but fundamentally, I think it's important to have a more diverse teaching body. That's the answer. I wish I had a...
I wish I could talk to you more. That's an area I'm looking at in my dissertation, and I've taught abroad in the Middle East and Korea, and I've taught in DC and Chicago and Atlanta and LA. So with the work that you're doing, what Danae's doing, and I just think about the intersectionality of all that and the way it plays out. Yeah.
There are ways to, of course, I think, even the material that's being used in teaching is important. That idea that every child should see herself reflected in some way and in a way that's normal. And I keep saying this because I have a 3-year-old and I've become increasingly interested in children's books. And I'm struck by how many of the books that have Black children in them are often very sort of noble. So the children are going off for the Martin Luther King March, right? or it's always sort of, and I'm like, can the children just play? Right? So it's sort of like Black children have to be, there's always there's something to do with, the civil rights movement, or it's somehow something to do with slavery, and I'm just like, Jesus Christ. I just want to have Black children who are just playing and doing the things that children do. And so when I keep talking about sort of making it ordinary and normal, that's what I mean. And also, I think, people talk a lot about that expression, people of color, which I use sometimes, but I also feel that it's important sometimes to parse that because there are different concerns, right? So people of color is a broad thing. I think, for example, that it's important for us to have in books characters whose mothers are covered, right? They're observant, and brown, and observant and white. Who are, I guess my point is when I went to the bookstore and I said, oh, I'm looking for more diverse books, and the woman kindly showed me a book with Korean kids, which was fine, but I was like, can I also have one with black children, please? Right, because it kind of feels like people of color is one lump, so anybody who's not white we should be grateful for. And I'm like, we don't just want one, we want like a range. But anyway, sorry, I think I'm rambling.
I was too. So. Thank you.
You had a question?
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much for your beautiful speech. I'm Pearl Owe, and as a Black Nigerian woman studying internationally here in America, I've been really inspired by you also because of your journey studying here in America. I've been really inspired by how you stayed really true to your Nigerian heritage, and even everything that you were able to gain from your education was put into the context of your background and Nigeria and Africa as a whole in your activism. And I just was wondering, what would you say was really important that you kept in mind throughout your journey that allowed you to do so?
So were you born here, or where did you grow up? In
I was born
Nigeria?
in Nigeria.
Did you grow up there? Did you spend?
No.
No?
I grew up in South Africa, and I went to an American school there. Yeah.
Okay. You didn't go to the African Leadership Academy, did you?
No.
Okay. No, it's a very good school. I was just thinking. So I think I often say that everything I know I learned in primary school in Nsukka. I think I stopped sort of absorbing information at the age of 10, which was about when I left primary school. So everything I know, but really it's more that I'm proud of where I come from. I'm the person I am today because I was raised by my parents in Nsukka, because I was raised in a cultural space that was very Igbo, but also very academic. So we you know, on the one hand, there were books and it was a very academic space. On the other hand, it was a deeply Igbo cultural space where you had respect for your elders, where after you had every meal, you said thank you to every adult in the room, which apparently people find strange, but any Igbo person knows that that's what you do to show respect. And I think having that sense of a cultural grounding, I think was useful for me. And I've just never felt the need to apologize for who I am. And it's not that America hasn't tried to give me opportunities to apologize for who I am, but I've just refused to take them. Because, I remember when I first came to the US, and I came from an English-speaking country, and I arrived in the US, and people started talking to me very slowly. Do you want to? And I was just like, what is wrong with them? But then I realized, because my accent is not American, they immediately assume you can't speak English, right? So they start talking to you like you're a moron, right? Because, and I remember then thinking, darling, you're the one who can't speak English. Saying things like, lay down, that's not English. So I came with Nigerian arrogance is the answer to your question. And I really encourage everybody, even if you're not Nigerian, you can tap into our arrogance. It really helps. It helps, because we're just like, yeah, we're like, no, but really. No, but just that sense of don't apologize for who you are. Just don't do it, right? You're enough. We live in a world that often tells Black women, African women, that we need more than we are. That's not true. That's not true at all. We're enough. We're more than enough. And I think the world also often tells women in general, and this is often what I say to young women, you're enough. You are enough. There's no need to apologize for anything. Don't apologize for occupying space in the world. Don't apologize for dreaming and wanting to do more. Don't apologize for being ambitious. Those are the things that I've tried to live by on my own terms in my own life. And also knowing that you're going to fail, right? You're going to fail, but then you do better. My thing is, I think of my life instead of writing fiction, that I start off writing a book and I don't quite know where it's going. I'm kind of feeling my way through, and I keep telling myself, you're going to fall down a few times, but you're going to get up. And it's often helped me. I mean, of course, when you fall down, it's terrible, right? It's not fun. But it's that thing telling yourself, I'm going to get up, that helps. And I've kind of tried to live my life like that. And I also have a wonderful family, so that helps. I'm very much a daddy's girl. My father is 86, and I'm still a complete daddy's girl. That helps.
Thank you.
Okay. One more?
Yes, yes.
All right.
I'm having fun.
Final question. You decide.
Hi, I love you. I appreciate you. Thank you for everything you've done for Black girls like myself and many others in this room. I just want to say I love you. I'm currently a grad student getting my Master's of Architecture. So I have a class here and I was like, oh my God, she's coming. And I was very, very happy to see that you're coming. Shout outs to USC, shout outs to Willow Bay and everybody that had anything to do with bringing you here. But my question just has to kind of bounce off yours, and it's just, as a Black face in mostly predominantly white spaces, how did you do it? Literally, I know you're saying you're enough, but before you got to where you were and you got that acclamation and people yes, you are welcome into these rooms now. Yeah. Where I am right now, obviously I'm still getting there. I'm gonna be there soon, hopefully one day. But just how did you deal with that just before you got to there, being a Black face in predominantly white spaces?
Yeah. I think that's a very good question. And, there are many answers. And I think maybe it seems to me that sort of an offshoot of the question is, were there times that you needed to suppress who you are in order to fit in? And I think maybe the honest answer is, I'm sure that, yes, maybe a few times. But I do think that, so I'll tell you a story. When I wrote my first novel, what became my first novel, Purple Hibiscus, I had an editor who felt that I should take out what she called the African language from the manuscript, because I had bits of Igbo sprinkled in the book, because I felt it was important to have a texture of language in the book. I have characters who are speaking, as I do, 2 languages often at the same time. And she said, oh, you need to take out the African material. And I said, no. Now, I was desperate to be published, right? And there were many things I was willing to do to be published, but it was a question of, where do I draw the line? And for me, it was there, right? If she'd said to me, we need you to, I don't know, do a dance, I would. And I say this as somebody who has no rhythm. So this is actually it would be a major thing. But really, for me, it's a question, what was I willing to take? And I said no. And it was a back and forth. And I think they were surprised by this first-time author who was desperate to be published, who was grateful that these publishers had taken me on, but who was unwilling to, because I felt that by doing that, I was somehow, that my book would lose something. In being a, it's hard to say, because in some ways I would then have to, there's a sense in which I don't like to be my own therapist. I don't like to psychoanalyze myself, because it's too much darkness there to have to unravel. But in general, and if I were to say, here's what I think you should do, right? There are times when, and this is going to sound a bit cynical, but I believe it. There are times when, in order to get into the room, you have to put some things in your pocket that you really don't want to, so that you can get into the room. And then when you get into the room, you take a club and smash the room. And Willow, I just want to say I am not advocating violence. That was metaphorical language.
Not our room, somebody else's room.
Not, of course, not in this wonderful space.
So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. As our young architect just said, I hope you have felt the love and the admiration.
I have, very much. Thank you.
We have benefited from your wit and from your wisdom. Denai, thank you for your beautiful introduction and for joining us at an incredibly busy time. Marty Kaplan, my partner, Lear Center founder, and the Ev Rogers Award Committee, thank you for your brilliant choice and recipients. And thank you to all of you for sharing what, thanks to the phenomenal Ms. Adichie, was a truly memorable and moving evening. So thank you all.
Thank you.